Welcome to TeleGeography Explains the Internet, the show that explores the business behind all of the ways humans stay connected around the world. I'm your host, Greg Bryan, and today we are continuing our series all about the topic that perhaps more people know telegeography for than any other: submarine cables. When submarine cables hit the mainstream media, it's often because they're down for one reason or another, particularly when they're located at a bottleneck that slows down or, in rare cases, even stops internet traffic for some people. My guest today presented a paper at Suboptic 25 detailing their study on global submarine cable maintenance and their recommendations for the industry. I have joining me Mike Constable, who's a principal at Infra-Analytics, and Alan Mauldin, research director here at TeleGeography. And they're going to discuss their paper and its review of cable faults, the readiness of the industry to fix the problems that we might have coming in the next few years. So, of course, we here at TeleGeography are big supporters of data-driven solutions. So their goal, as you're going to hear, was to present a common set of facts around the state of the industry for cable maintenance, from which the submarine cable industry can start to assess the situation accurately. You will hear all about their model, its inputs, and the conclusions they come to based on the study. They highlighted hotspots for cable faults and issues that might be particular to those choke points, and of course, what recommendations they have for all of the people involved in the submarine cable industry to handle these potential issues. But of course, before we get to the conversation, please like and subscribe the show. Find me on LinkedIn, find our guests on LinkedIn or wherever you can, and tell a friend to listen. Very much appreciate your support and always look forward to your comments and suggestions. Okay, enjoy the episode. Welcome to the show, Alan and Mike.
Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Happy to be here again. It's been a long time.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And Mike, your first time, so thanks for joining us all the way from Thailand, right?
Yes, sunny Phuket. Yes.
Nice. So it is evening for you, so I'll try to keep this to our timeline. But yeah, let's kick it off with just both of you introduce yourselves, kind of a quick background for the audience on who you are and what you do.
Yeah, I'll go first, Greg. I'm Alan Mauldin. I'm a director of network infrastructure research at TeleGeography. Been here about 25 years now. And one area I focus on heavily is submarine cables. So, Mike?
Okay. Hence today. Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, hi. My name's Mike Constable. I've been in this subsea telecom cable business for about 30 years on both the investment side and the supply side. So, it's a small community. I know Alan very well. It's a pleasure to meet you.
And likewise.
More recently, after leaving industry, per se, I've set up a consulting organization called Infra-Analytics, and I really focus on the investment side of subsea cables, primarily with private equity and investment banks, etc.
Excellent. And you have some history of collaboration with I don't work on submarine cables at all, hence us meeting for the first time here, but collaboration with Alan and his team on submarine cables at TeleGeography?
Yes. So, obviously one of the things that we've collaborated deeply on is this report that we're going to talk about. But as I said, it is a small industry, and we've worked together previously, particularly when I was on the investment side of cables.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Excellent. All right. Yeah. So what we're talking about today is this paper that you guys presented at the Suboptic conference a few months ago now, as we're recording here, on the future of submarine cable maintenance. And so I just want to start out right out of the gate of why is subsea cable maintenance a key issue in the industry currently?
Yeah, perhaps I can take that.
Please. Yeah.
Yeah, this report or paper really germinated out of some other work I was doing. And it really comes about because the maintenance side of cables is really at the intersection of a number of macro environmental factors and also internal factors associated with the industry. The first point factor being there's a significant investment in new cable systems coming, and I'm sure Alan will talk about that a bit more. At the same time, for those of us who are a bit older and were around in the dot-com bubble, again, at that stage, late 90s to 2000s, we had a huge amount of cable systems deployed in the oceans. Mm-hmm. Now they're getting to their end of service life, so we expect to see a bunch of these legacy systems coming up for retirement or decommissioning. Another factor is really we have an aging vessel fleet. And we have a global fleet of assets of about 61 ships. A number of those, or about 24 of those, I think, from memory, in the cable maintenance sector. Overall, the aging fleet is a concern. We're not getting consistent reinvestment in these assets. So by default, we are looking to adjacent market sectors, the oil and gas industry, etc., and purchasing second-hand ships of a number of years of age already and converting them to take up telecom duties, particularly in the maintenance side of things. From an external point of view, we have a lot more government scrutiny on the resilience of this critical infrastructure. Governments in the last few years have been designating subsea cables as critical infrastructure of national security importance. And particularly of importance is the global digital transformation of the economy. So a lot more government scrutiny, and certainly media scrutiny too, with events such as the Nord Stream pipeline and the cable issues in the Baltic and around Taiwan. And the last point I think is quite important is certainly in my work, and I think Alan would agree in his work, we're finding a number of governments don't really understand the challenges of the cable maintenance sector, but also they lack an education on how these sort of private agreements work. So to educate a broader group of stakeholders across our ecosystem was quite important. So that was another reason why we thought this was timely to do. So to increase that stakeholder knowledge.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Your second and third points there, I can certainly say, whatever small part it might have been, I know that Alan and our colleague Tim Strong have certainly played a role in educating various government entities on the importance of this infrastructure as well as challenges facing it. So I think that's really interesting to hear that's sort of part of the specific purpose here. What were your specific goals? Like, what did you hope to accomplish by undertaking the study? As I understand from Alan, it was no small undertaking, not just like a presentation at a conference, but really months of work, right? Going into this. What did you both hope to get out of it?
I think the key purpose was, in the context of all these challenges and factors that I just mentioned, it really was around getting a bunch of key industry stakeholders around a table with a common set of data-driven facts, as best as we know them, which comes from Alan's model, to look at and address the challenges that we are facing. So without that common set of facts, it's very hard to get a discussion going. So if we can get stakeholders sitting around a table with that paper and those facts in front of them, you've got a starting point for discussions, and I think that's pretty crucial. Alan, perhaps you want to chip in there too?
Yeah, Mike, I think you're absolutely right. I think one of the key aims was to provide that basic set of facts we could all agree upon as an industry. I think the industry is quite aware there's an issue with the age of ships and is fully aware of that. But to present the data in a way that was able for everyone to see, this study is available for the public to look at. So, and I think not just the insiders, but as Mike mentioned, also the government to understand what's going on. What are these terms we're using? What is the state of play that's happening in the market overall? So the model task that we were assigned, it seems easy. Oh, just forecast the number of ships you need by 2040. That's easy, right? You got to kind of back out. How do you figure that out, right? So you got to go starting at the bottom, we had to figure out how many cables are we going to have in the water in the next 15 years. That's easy, right? Well, it's pretty challenging to figure out that we're having to figure out what drives the new builds, where are they going to be, which parts of the world. And then besides the new builds, you have, as Mike said, all these old cables many cables are already 25 years old. Cables have a minimum design life of 25 years, so they're on the precipice of being turned off, you would assume, right? So you take out some old cables, you bring in some new ones. What's the net impact going to be over the next 15 years? That gives you a baseline of the kilometers. That's important because the amount of kilometers is how you charge for maintenance services, first of all, but also the more kilometers in the water, the higher chance of faults happening to the cables, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So we had the kilometers, and then we tried to figure out from that, look at some data we got from Ocean IQ on historical rates of repairs in different parts of the world, had that kind of forecast out to the future to give us our repair rate. And then we could figure out from there with the data that Mike had on the maintenance vessels, where they are and how many days they're able to maintain cables and fix repairs, to conduct repairs, to figure out how many ships at the minimum do we need to maintain the current service, and then going forward what we would require in the future. So that's roughly at a high level what we did. That's a pretty quick run through of the whole model, but
Yeah.
that's how it
I
works.
think
No, that's
the
great.
challenge there, we also had it, and all credit to Alan and his team, is because we also had to break this down by region. Some
Right.
regions, and maybe we can touch on this later, some regions have a greater number of repairs. Other regions have more or less cable ships to address those repairs. To understand all those dynamics in the market was a huge task, certainly in terms of modeling.
The number of global repairs has been fairly flat the last decade or so, but our model ended up showing a bit of an increase in repairs by 2040, which might seem kind of odd, but if you realize most regions that we in the forecasts, they were pretty flat repairs, but it's the Asian area, like the intra-Asia, where you have it's shallower waters, a lot of fishing, other issues happening there. So it's currently where there are the most faults. And with all the cables coming in there, we do think there could be more faults happening there in the future. But trying to forecast faults is a pretty challenging thing to do, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike, I really like the way that you phrase it. That it's well known in the industry that there's an issue here. You need to sit down with like a set of objective facts, right, and actually figure out like where to start from. I think coming from my end of the telecom world, which is much more kind of the tech end, if you will, right. So it's become a cliche to say there's a solution in search of a problem, right. I like this approach of really breaking it down and saying exactly what do we need and how can we think about that going forward, rather than kind of just going out first and saying what could we do to mitigate this. You have to first understand very well what exactly we need to mitigate, where, how, etc. So on that note,
sorry,
yeah, please.
I can just add there. I mean, I think it's important for people to understand we didn't do this in isolation. We did have a great deal of outreach to industry and to governments to get their feeling and thoughts on the challenges that we're facing. Right. There was a lot of input and collaboration from the industry. So Alan and I weren't working in isolation on this. There was a massive amount of input.
Yeah, that's a great point. So on that point, then, you've talked, especially Alan here, a little bit about exactly what factors were going into what kind of data you were collecting. Can you just give us a little bit more of the nitty gritty of when you're going to create this model? What kind of survey data kind of were you doing? Who was participating in this? What parties did you need to get data from? That kind of thing.
Yeah, sure. So what I discussed originally was the model we developed for the kilometers and the fault and the vessel requirements. And that was through a discussion with network operators who are building the cables, the suppliers who understand the capacity of cables in the future. That's a key area to understand how many cables you're going to need, because how much bandwidth they're going to carry. So that was one angle we looked into as well. And then Mike spent a lot of time talking to the maintenance providers themselves to understand, the number of days to conduct repairs, for example, things like this. The other angle, which we didn't touch on yet, was that also our colleague Greg Lane Burnett helped us with a lot heavily, was on this survey we did of the industry. And we did a survey asking people about a wide variety of questions about the maintenance industry, factors that they wanted to see change, things that were good. What role should the government have? Would they be willing to pay more for maintenance services? So all of that survey, those findings help to really play into the result to give it more of a grounded feel for what the industry is actually thinking, not just, as Mike said, me and him and Lane sitting in a room just trying to make this up without any advice from the outside world. So we really did a good job of reaching out. I think it was over 60 different entities who gave a response to the survey, and that's
wow.
We heard from I think every maintenance provider, the hyperscalers, carriers, a large number of governments as well.
So this really was like an industry collaboration, ultimately.
Absolutely.
Yeah, very much so. I think one of the key things is, I mentioned this aging fleet and sporadic investment in new assets. I don't think, certainly not to my knowledge, no one sat down and assessed the fleet in terms of age, etc., and end of life. So, just a few things that weren't so surprising to me, but I think may be surprising to others. Close to 50% of our global fleet, and that's maintenance ships and installation or construction ships, are going to reach their end of use by date in the next 15 years. Now, in terms of maintenance fleet, that's even a worse number. 65% of those assets are going to reach their end of service life in the next 15 years. So, we see this issue with this aging fleet, talking about the cable kilometers and the repairs, whether they're going up or down, really on a regional basis, breaking it down to a regional basis, gave us, a great deal of insight into specific regions and where additional assets are needed to cater for the increased cable kilometers, and that's based on the historical repair rates with some tweaking on that. And that's where Alan's work was critical. Alan and TeleGeography's work was critical.
One interesting thing here with this model and the results are, I think we show the need for investment in 15 new vessels by 2040 to replace ones that will be retired, plus the additional 5 within Asia to cover new repair requirements there. But so even if you were to say, well, the faults are going to go down or be flat, well, okay, fine, but you still need to have 15 vessels regardless. So even if you disagree with the forecast we did for the number of repairs, the ships are the ships, and they're getting older, as Mike said. So there's going to be new investment required eventually.
The key thing about that too is why we need this massive amount of 15 assets to replace, and an additional 5 to counter or to help out with the increased amount of repairs. That is to keep the same service level that we have now. That's not to improve the service level. And, particularly in Southeast Asia, which Alan mentioned, which is a higher rate of faults, about 50% of all global annual faults occur in the South China Sea region. And, that is because about 50% of the world's fishing fleet operate in that region, and also a bunch of other factors. So this is just to keep the same service levels. It's not to improve them. And what we're finding, certainly from an industry perspective, one of the key issues that the industry has in terms of efficiency and speed of repair is having to obtain permits. Now, when you're talking about the South China Sea with this huge amount of repairs, respectively, versus global repairs, this is a perfect storm in terms of the multiple overlapping maritime jurisdictional claims. So that slows up repairs. So, all these things have to factor into the way we look at this and the way we look to improve the efficiency of the way we use our assets and the efficiency in terms of time to repair, because that's all about resilience of networks.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm doing another episode in this little submarine cable series on the podcast that we're in now on security, and that was one of the things I discussed there is how, from the security perspective, one of the difficulties of submarine cables is there's different compliance and requirements on every place you land. So you're saying that affects the maintenance as well. How specifically does it in that sense? Is it in terms of getting? Do you have to get permissions to go close to shore and find the cables and things like that? Is it as simple as that, or is it more complicated even?
No, it's relatively simple in those terms. Now, I won't get into the regulatory side in terms of the UNCLOS law, but yes, typically a repair ship has to have permission from various government entities, particularly in Southeast Asia, many government entities where there's an overlapping jurisdictional claim. And that permission to undertake that repair is for either exclusive economic zone waters or territorial waters. Typically, territorial water permits take longer to get, and that sort of comes to around to certain geopolitical issues and the regulatory side of things. So one of the things that has become key, one of the key findings is the collaboration between government and industry is pretty inconsistent. And, again, part of this was to help educate governments into how we do things. So to get a greater dialogue between industry and government is critical, so that when they're developing policy, they understand the challenges and the effects that it has on our industry in terms of keeping the resilience in networks by repairing cables in a timely manner. And I think a lot of the product of that is the fact that the industry moved from quasi-government ownership and control in the late 80s, early 90s through the telecom deregulation era into private hands. And, there's kind of been a period of benign neglect from those days until, perhaps 5 to 10 years ago when government started.
They say it's not our problem anymore, private industry, you take care of it, right?
Exactly. And now suddenly, hang on, these are critical infrastructure for our nation, for security purposes, and we don't really know what's going on. That dialogue and collaboration between industry and government needs to deepen. I think that was a key finding that we found.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially like you said in South China Sea, Southeast Asia in particular, it's so fractured. Both the physical geography and the political geography are extremely fractured compared to other regions. So I'm sure that's why that's a major hotspot kind of challenge area. Are there other hotspot areas that you identified geographically around the world? I know one that comes up in the news as a not a layperson, but not a submarine cable expert, of course, would be getting across into the Mediterranean Sea, past a lot of geopolitical hotspots, right, that have been in the news, right? Anything to highlight there or other regions?
Yeah, I think you're correct in that. The industry has certain choke points where this infrastructure is deployed. The Red Sea is certainly one of those. There has been a choke point between Taiwan and the Philippines. And if we go back many years, we had a major issue there where a number of cables were cut due to subsea landslides, etc. The way the industry is looking at deploying new infrastructure is to build resilience into the global network and a lot more diversity and redundancy. And given the fact that, we have some history and understanding of the seabed regions around the world and certainly the fault rates, we are looking to deploy infrastructure outside of those sort of choke points and those hotspots, if you will.
We should also add, who is doing this building is a pretty key aspect of this as well. I mean, most of the new cables are being funded by heavily two companies. It's Google and Meta, right? And so as they increasingly account for a larger share of the cables in service, whether or not they built them themselves or they are the largest owner of a consortium cable, they have a bigger interest in what happens in the maintenance sector. And you see some of the traditional carriers having less of an interest, less of a say. And as those cables get turned off, those cables kind of go away. So you're seeing a shifting of really who is holding the control of the direction of the industry, certainly for the next 15 years.
Right, which is a change that has implications far beyond our conversation here, even, right? So, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Just so that we can hit this, because I know that my subcable colleagues who get invited on major media like CNN or whatever, it's usually on this topic, right? Those of us in the industry know that the actual threats to submarine cables are by and large fishing, right? You mentioned underwater landslides, things like that. I actually had on Mike Clare and Izzy Yo a couple of years ago talking about the physical sort of dangers to submarine cables. it always hits the news when they think that it's a terrorist oriented or sort of geopolitical issue. How likely did you find that to be a problem in doing this study in your model? And can we sort of lay out the likelihood of threats here, if that makes sense?
Certainly, in terms of the way the governments are looking at this, whether it's multilateral institutions like the EU or individual governments, there's a lot more focus on maritime domain awareness and the risk assessments
Mm-hmm.
around that. So that includes all critical infrastructure, but a number of other issues, anything to do with the maritime sector, if you will. So that whether it's people trafficking or smuggling, etc. And what we're seeing with those risk assessments, they are now including cables into those broader MDA or maritime domain awareness programs. And security analysis, I think. And by default, they are also looking at the supply chain resilience. So it's all about network resilience. And, certainly the US government has initiated, a trusted networks initiative, which a number of other countries have signed up to. There was a statement that came out of the last UN annual general meeting in New York called the New York Principles. But what we're seeing now is governments now moving from a trusted networks perspective to a trusted ecosystem perspective, and that wraps in the cable maintenance aspect. I think the other thing which I touched on briefly is that for some governments who understand how the maintenance industry sector works, they are at least asking questions or trying to understand what risks, if any, there may be with foreign organizations, with foreign flagged ships and foreign crews undertaking repairs on critical infrastructure of national security importance within their territorial waters. And certainly some governments are doing those risk assessments. And that, I certainly know some governments are having discussions about should we have our own sovereign repair capability, i.e. a cable ship repair asset. So all of this is kind of wrapped up in the security aspect, which is quite vast, and a lot of focus on it, again, driven by what we read a lot in the media, Nord Stream, as I mentioned before, the Baltic and Taiwan. Sorry, Alan, I jumped in there.
No, that was a great overview, Mike. I would just have a different kind of comment here in terms of we do see in the media this all the talk about this was sabotage, this was that. There's a lot of media attention around this, but if you look globally, again, as we said before, the faults have been fairly constant. I think it was like 203 faults globally last year. Now, whenever you look at what causes faults, the data that you get is like it's anchors, it's fishing. Sabotage is an intent; it isn't a cause of the fault, right? It's do they intend to do it? So
one could intentionally drop an anchor, and that's going to look the same in the data, right?
And we don't have any data on intent of faults. I would suspect the vast majority is accidental, as it has been through most of the history. And many of these areas where you hear about faults these days, like around Taiwan and China, that's always been an area of high faults. It's not a new thing. So some of it is just the media coverage now. It's a awareness bias that they're like, oh, people are aware of it, so they hear about it. It's happening all the time, right? But it's not. It's kind of been consistently in the background with faults happening. There's a fault in the world every 3-4 days.
Yeah. We call that the availability heuristic, Alan.
There you go. That's the proper term. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. It's
recency bias, the example, whatever you want to call
it. Yeah. You always give, like, if you buy a Toyota Camry, all of a sudden you notice there's Toyota Camrys everywhere. Right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. And again, as someone who is certainly not a layperson on the street, but not focused on this professionally all the time, it's still surprising to me to hear you say that there's 200 plus faults annually, because they mainly get onto my radar when it's a big deal, when it's a bottleneck, that kind of thing. So I think important to put in actual data points so that people understand the context of these things. I think that's exactly what you guys are doing here, right? So yeah, so let's talk about the cable repair business itself, right? So we've touched on this a bit already, but first I want to start with I'm again when I think about these things from the side of the telecom world that I'm really familiar with, like enterprise networks, for example. If you're talking about the security of an enterprise network or the availability of it, right, that starts at the very beginning, right, where when I'm designing my network and sourcing it, that is where the most important security and availability comes into play, right? Did I choose diverse providers that are actually on different sides of the street, or different bridges crossing this or that river, so that if there's a fault, I'm not dead in the water, right? So can you take us through kind of how you would advise cable builders? You said there's a lot of cables coming online in the next several years, right? Even compared to some other periods of big submarine cable builds. What do you guys want to say to them about, like, stopping faults before they start, if you will?
It's a great question, and it's a difficult one to sort of pin down. I think the industry has a pretty robust process from the start of germinating a new investment in the cable through to deployment and commissioning. We do have a robust risk assessment in terms of what do we do to help protect this cable from external aggression, and that starts at the feasibility study area. We are, as networks have been built out in most parts of the world, we are pretty familiar with seabed now, with the seabed in various regions. We talked about hotspots. So avoiding those hotspots. And I think, where Alan mentioned before, just because we have a huge amount of cable kilometres coming in, a net increase of about 800,000, I think it is, on top of the 1.6 million we've already got in the water. It doesn't automatically mean that cable faults rise, because we are bringing in new technology. We bury the cable deeper, for example. We have better knowledge of the seabed, which I mentioned. And there's other technologies now where we use AIS tracking to monitor corridors around cables. So if we see vessels loitering in that region, you get on channel 16 and radio the vessel to say, hey, you're near a cable.
That's
the
very
legislation around protection of cables obviously varies from nation to nation. I know of only one or two situations where cable owners have taken shipping companies to court because they have, in their view, either maliciously or with negligence created a problem and caused a fault. And that's fair enough, because cable, the cost of repairing a cable can be anything from a few $100,000 to up to $1 million, really depending on where it is. So it is, for cable owners, maintenance is the biggest line item OPEX component they have for operating that cable once it's built. So wherever they can increase the security of that asset, reduce repairs, hits their bottom line. So it's quite important from that perspective. I think that the last thing I'll just add there is the way the models that we in the industry have developed, going back 40 to 50 years, these consortium zone models where cable owners club together to help share the cost of having maintenance assets in that region on standby, ready to go out and repair a cable. That is a very unique model. No other industry, for example, the power cable industry, works on that model. It's quite efficient. In that respect, it is a cost sharing. And in a simplistic terms, it's kind of like your car insurance. As Alan mentioned before, you pay your share to have those assets on standby based on how many cable kilometers you have in a certain zone. So that's kind of like your insurance policy, a fixed cost for cable owners. Then if you need to call a ship out to repair your cable, you pay a variable cost, the running cost of that ship. So that's kind of like the excess on your car insurance policy. So it is a very efficient and unique structure, the models that we have developed. And they're tried and tested.
Now, does that model change at all with what Alan brought up earlier, the change in the ownership structure? So you're mentioning specifically the consortium model that's been around for decades. Is the sort of commercial model for repair different if the owner is, say, one hyperscaler or content provider?
Theoretically not. Yeah, I mean,
It's just that they're bearing all of that cost. That's the only difference
they
themselves,
are
right? Yeah.
bearing, because
Yeah.
they have so many cable kilometers deployed. Yeah, they were bearing a
Mm-hmm.
greater cost. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So, one of the things I mentioned earlier was part of the study was to look at those models. Are they impacting the fact that we're not seeing steady investment in new assets? Are the economics of those
Mm-hmm.
models working for the industry to allow and facilitate investment in new assets? Um, so,
Right.
because I can certainly see, and I think the study will show that we have an inefficiency in the way we use these assets. We do have
Mm-hmm.
competing models. Um, I talked about the consortium model. We have a similar sort of model, operates in a very similar way. It's called a private zone. And these overlap. So competition is good and healthy in any industry. But the competition
Right.
structures we have between these different models or different zones, similar models, that competition is based on overlapping boundaries and cost. And that's just a drive to the
Mm-hmm.
bottom line. It's not based on service
Right.
quality. So, one of the key things that we highlighted in this report was look, let's relook at the way we um, compete in this space. Not to say competition is
Mm-hmm.
bad, but let's look at a way we can restructure the competition dynamic and structure to drive more efficiency into this sector.
And in terms of the physical infrastructure for submarine cable repairs, Mike, sort of at the beginning, you mentioned that the aging fleet and all of that. What are you guys specifically recommending to the industry in terms of readying the ships themselves? Are you looking at maybe retrofitting other ships retired from other purposes, that kind of thing, or?
Well, that's certainly in play now. I mentioned earlier
Hmm.
that about 70% of our maintenance fleet is converted assets, second-hand assets, an
Right.
average age of 16 years old before we convert them and bring them into the sector. Um, but we're very careful not to recommend specific things. What we did
Gotcha.
in the report was to open up different ideas that maybe the industry needs to discuss, to highlight
Hmm.
things like this is the capex for a new asset. Um, as we pointed out, we think that 15 assets need to be replaced in the next 15 years, plus an additional 5 to maintain those existing service levels at a cost of about $3 billion.
Hmm.
Now, that may sound like a lot of money, but I think as Alan can detail a bit more, a snapshot of the investment in new systems just over the next couple of years is about $13 billion. So $3 billion is a very tiny number when you're putting the significant billions into investing in new systems, but we don't have the similar
Hmm.
investment or balanced investment in the cable maintenance assets, which drives that resilience of the network.
Yeah, one thing I thought was interesting is you mentioned, Mike. Sometimes it can be like a race to the bottom with pricing. And in our survey that we did, the industry, we asked respondents if they would be willing to pay more for maintenance service if it would reduce the repair times or wait
Hmm.
times. And
Hmm.
I was surprised that half the people said they would be willing to pay more,
Hmm.
Mm,
Hmm.
yeah.
and 30% said they wouldn't, and 20% said they weren't sure. But
Right.
considering half people weren't opposed outright to higher costs for maintenance, is kind of an encouraging finding. Thinking about trying to get this new investment, will people pay more to help fund it? There's openness to that.
That was a really interesting point. That surprised me as well. And I think the other thing that we learned from the industry, particularly the cable owners, is the fact that while we're building more diversity and redundancy into the global network, the desire to even increase the speed of cable repairs is still
Hmm.
there. So you'd think that if we're
Hmm.
building more diversity in, maybe we don't need repair assets on site or the availability of repair assets to be the same as what it is today. But quite specific, I can't remember the statistic, but an overwhelming, I think it was around 80% of network operators said, while we're getting more diversity into the network, we still need immediacy of repair just
Hmm.
as much as it is now, if not greater. Hence, Alan's point on people willing to pay more to have a faster repair solution.
Yeah, that I find that really interesting. I mean, there's very few cases, right, where a submarine cable outage really makes a whole city or region dark. It's all a matter of switching to other cables, but being willing to have your cable come online as quickly as possible, even if that costs more, I think is fascinating. I wonder, from the telegeography perspective, right? One of the things that we do is look around at the economic geography of telecom services. Submarine cables, obviously, very much a part of that, and look at the big differences around the world, right? So if we're talking about the price per bit that a carrier is earning for selling lit service on a transatlantic route is very different than the price per bit that they're earning for going to. So we mentioned Southeast Asia, for example, back to the west coast of the U.S. Say, do you think that might have an impact on the ability to sort of fund these maintenance? Or do you think that the economies of scale in the transatlantic might work out, so it's not really something that they're not going to be slower to repair in the transatlantic, say, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, all the investment in the Atlantic is by hyperscalers. It's not by
Right.
any
Right.
carriers. So the price of a 100 gig wave right now doesn't have any bearing in those investments, I don't believe, right? It's being driven by the inter data center capacity
Yeah,
requirements of the
massive demand
hyperscalers.
between Europe and the U.S., and so that's
Right.
just
I mean, the cost of cables varies by how long they are generally in the
right.
capacity, the number of landings, but the length is a primary determinant of the overall cost of cables. But I think for the cost of the maintenance, I mean, Mike knows more about this than I do about, I would assume there's a higher cost for maintenance where you have more repairs happening. So in Southwest Asia or Southeast Asia,
Or
rather,
maybe,
you have
Mike,
a lot
where
more.
the repairs are. Sorry to interrupt, Alan. Maybe where the repairs are geographically more difficult. So I would imagine that the Pacific Ocean, right? You can. There's a way that one can spin the globe and see almost nothing but Pacific Ocean, right? So that has to add cost to the repair of those cables, right?
Yeah, and I mentioned the variable costs that network owners have when they call out a ship for repair, and that can vary
Mm-hmm.
from a couple of $100,000 to maybe up to $1 million. Um, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
that depends on exactly, excuse me, where the repair is. So therefore, the
Right.
transit time from the base port of the cable ship also
Yes.
adds to time and therefore cost. Is if the cable at that fault location or repair location is buried, so
Mm-hmm.
finding it may take longer, and then reburying it takes longer. So a lot of it
Right.
depends on location. Um, with respect to baseport locations, location of repair with respect to baseport, and just the dynamics around the seabed. The deeper you operate in the sea, the longer everything takes. So
Of
mid
course.
Pacific,
Yeah.
7,000 meters deep, takes a lot longer to work with anything on the seabed than in shallow waters where there's maybe 300 or 400 meters.
Right.
But
Now,
it's worth mentioning
correct me
that
if I'm wrong.
the vast majority of faults are in the
Right.
shallow water.
That's
Like there's very
that's what I was going to
small
ask. Yeah. Yeah.
share
Yeah.
is in
Yeah.
the deep sea,
Yeah,
right?
good point.
Yeah, certainly there are some geologic features in mid-sea that might cause faults, but for the most part, people are fishing pretty close to the shore and things like that, right? So, yeah,
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, excellent. All right, so this has been really fascinating. I've learned a lot. I wonder if you guys could maybe sort of close us out with just a couple of things. Just first, how when you presented this at Suboptic, a lot of people have had the chance to see it now over the past several weeks. What has been the reaction from the industry? What kind of feedback have you gotten?
What I've heard, Greg, so far has been pretty positive feedback. People like that it was done in a impartial way, that we sought the input from the industry at large, and the data is all available for anyone to look at. So you can download the paper from our website or also from the Spotlight site as well. You can see the entire study. It's like 100 pages almost, right, Mike? I forget how big
Mm-hmm.
it is, but it was a lot of pages there. You can have a look at that yourself.
Yeah, so just to add to what Alan's saying, yeah, I mean, I've spoken to some of the key stakeholders that were behind helping to sponsor this study because it was
Mm-hmm.
sponsored by Suboptic and a number of other organisations.
Right.
They're very pleased, generally speaking, super pleased actually about the way it was structured and the non-biased nature of what we've done, which was
Mm-hmm.
always important. As Alan said, the fact that we collaborated with industry and sought their opinions. I've also spoken to certainly one government who were very interested in receiving this report, and I've had a few follow-up calls with them. They're trying to understand their region a bit more and how they can
Mm-hmm.
help in their region. particularly when it comes to whether it's government support to help invest in new assets, because perhaps the economic models aren't what they should be right now to allow that investment. So yeah, I think across the board, from an education perspective and from a broader stakeholder perspective, I've only got really, really good comments from that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously, I'd like to hear negative comments or areas where we
Right.
could have
Of
improved,
course.
but bottom line, it was about 5 months of our life in this, and there's so much more we could have done. There was so much more we could have done in terms of digging deeper into certain regions, but budget
Right.
and time frame precluded that.
Yep. Every project, that's my comment at the end. So I can now envision the project that I could have done if I had the resources, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, and it sounds like you've gotten not just feedback of like, hey, we like this, but some has spurred folks to try to get into gear, which I think is the real goal, right? And so that finally, guys, I just want to close out from both of you if you have anything to share here on just I always tell my guests all people consuming media now have so much input. It's always useful to repeat yourself. So at the risk of repeating yourselves, but just give me the real key takeaways that if as you're wrapping up, you want folks who are either in the submarine cable industry, or a lot of our listeners are just in the general telecom industry, but they're impacted by these kinds of things, right? If you're planning a network for anybody that's across more than one country, it usually involves a submarine cable, right? So what do you want folks to really walk away from this 5-month endeavor that you guys undertook?
That's tough. How do you distill 5 months of your life into a 5
That's
second
right.
clip? I don't know, Greg.
You can make it 30 seconds if you like. So that's
Yeah, I mean, I think from my point of view, it was my first time to get involved in the cable maintenance sector. So I think for somebody who's not necessarily familiar with the sector, the paper is a good way to kind of get some basic understanding of what's happening and how it works. And so
Right.
I think so people who maybe aren't the experts in the industry would get some value out of learning about this. So I think for an educational point of view, please read up on it. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to Mike or myself, and we'll be happy to talk to you as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just
Mike?
add to that, at the risk of repeating myself. I mean, as I said, with more government scrutiny, I think we are at risk, and we're already seeing it, to be honest, of greater regulation on the maintenance side. And we're already seeing that coming out of
Right.
the States just in the last couple of weeks.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
when you go through the regulatory process to build a cable, you go through, various institutions, for example, in the States, the FCC, to get your landing and operating license. I think there's going to be more scrutiny, not just on the asset you're building, but also who's looking after it and what's the ownership
Mhm.
behind that company that's looking after it. And so,
Right.
therefore, the maintenance providers. I think that's key. So the industry has to sort of understand where that's going, have a greater collaboration with governments. Now we do have the
Mhm.
ICPC, which works closely with broader stakeholder group. So more scrutiny from the government will lead to more regulation. We have to adapt to that, but also have that collaboration so we can input into the policy, or at least
Mhm.
have a dialogue about the policies that governments are bringing out. I
Mhm.
think the key thing also is for the industry to rethink our competitive dynamics. To how do we drive greater
Mhm.
efficiency into the assets we have, and how do we mitigate some sort of market uncertainty to facilitate investment in new assets? I think that's a key thing. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
and Yeah, I think it's an education tool, and I think we achieve that purpose. And as we said at the outset, it really is for people to sit down with a common set of facts, as best as we know it, to start a discussion about what are we facing, as best as we
Right.
know it, and how are we going to address that.
Mhm. Yeah, all really interesting points. I think the one that really sticks out for me is that that you kind of set it up early in the episode this way, that we have this world where there's this critical infrastructure from a national perspective, whatever nation you're talking about, that's being run usually by for-profit private entities, right? And that's anarchic all over the world because there are dozens of those right out there, hundreds even, right, involved in this particular area of the economy. So I think having a common set of facts to harmonize that chaos is really crucial. So I think thank you guys so much for doing this work. Yeah. How can folks keep up with you and keep up with the work? Obviously, our key point there is go and download the paper. We'll put a link to that, obviously, in the show notes. But if someone wants to keep up with you, Mike and Alan, what's the best way to find you?
LinkedIn is probably the best for me, I would say.
That's what almost everybody says, but I always want to make sure they get the chance, So yeah.
Yeah, I'm not going to hand out my private phone number on the internet, but yeah, so LinkedIn is obviously best. But
there's a small number of people out there who prefer folks follow them on X or have an old school blog or whatever. But usually it's LinkedIn. But I like to make sure. Yeah.
I think the other point is that the industry has a number of conferences, and Alan and his team, TeleGeography, are there. I'm usually there as well. And what we're seeing at these conferences, a broader stakeholder group of people are coming in, not just people from the industry. Certainly more governments are attending to understand this sector.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, so there's a lot of different stakeholders that might find value from these events beyond the traditional kind of carriers and whatnot. Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. All right. Thank you so much, guys. This was really great and informative. And just encouragement to listeners to download the paper and reach out with additional thoughts and questions. So, yeah. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks for listening. TeleGeography Explains the Internet comes from the experts here at TeleGeography. It's edited and produced by Jane Miller, and it's hosted by me, Greg Bryan. And I also wrote that theme song you're listening to right now. To learn more about our data, jump over to telegeography.com, and we'll see you on the internet.